I think important is, I think one point I want to make clear, that is, what is purpose of discussion, these subject. Not acquiring just mere knowledge, but because the real troublemaker is our own emotion. Of course, everybody, even animal, is want peace, because peace gives some kind of complete relax. That's even physically also, you see, that's useful. Human intelligence also ultimate source of problem, source of trouble. So the best way to tackle the part of our intelligence which creates trouble. Now we have to find out what kind of sort of our intelligence, wrong intelligence, where?
Like false or distorted.
Distorted intelligence.
What aspect, distorted aspects of the human intelligence.
So that's the real sort of troublemaker. So now the Buddhist approach is, firstly, pinpoint these negative intelligence, and then find out, to study the nature of that mental state, and then try to find out what is the counterforce within the intelligence. So that's the Buddhist way to tackle, to reduce these destructive intelligence or negative intelligence. So the very purpose of our discussion is supposed, to make clear all those troublemaker mind, and then how to counter. Right?
Counter them. How to counter them.
And then within the Buddhist tradition, Tibetan Buddhist tradition, generally, in the Buddhist tradition, Pali tradition, the Sanskrit tradition, and then Tibetan, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, so these Buddhist countries generally the follower of Sanskrit tradition. So particularly with Tibetan, because the real authentic masters, great masters of Nalanda, personally came to Tibet and introduced Buddhism. So since then, I think now more than 1,000 years in Tibet, there is very strong sort of tradition, study all those Nalanda masters' writing. So now, this text itself, one Nalanda master, his name Kamalashila, disciple of Chandarakshita. Both are great logician, Madhyamika philosopher. So both came to Tibet, and both died in Tibet. Then this particular text of Kamalashila, usually we believe wrote this in Tibet during some debate with some Buddhist master who following one section of Chinese tradition. The mainly meditation, without much sort of intellectual thinking. So during that period, now he wrote this this text. Actually, there, the persons.
This is actually a part of a cycle of 3 texts known as the first and the middle and the last stages of meditation, bhavana gramas.
And also this text, I had the oral transmission from Kamalashila himself, from Kamalashila himself, then up to my teacher.
So the reading, oral transmission of this text remains uninterrupted, stemming from Kamalashila up to His Holiness's teacher.
One Acharya Lama, his name, Sanjit is Buddha. Buddha Buddha Shasana,
Shasana Dara, no.
Buddha Shasana
Dara, no.
Sanjit Dinzi.
Dara, no.
Great scholar, a great practitioner. Now read text. Hold the way.
The translation of this text is on page 52.
Dilo tamje kyamba ni shindu nyudu tobar ndeba, tobar ndeba te, tobar shebe, gyunam de, gyenam de, ngombar, zambar chawo.
So the text opens with a statement which we read: the intelligent who wishes to actualize omniscience extremely quickly should make a deliberate effort to fulfill its causes and conditions.
That the Shabdama, the law watching, the deshe the Tamje Kembe Gobanse, the Gudikan and Yongu Yaris. Karas do no go Tamja, Gudikan and Rodastaris. Tamje Kembe Gobande and Moburis, Gudikan and Rogure, that is Sundua.
Subsequent to this opening statement, there are, a couple of other statements which are sentences that are part of the same paragraph, where the main point Kamalashila is making is that attainment of the omniscient state of Buddhahood does not come about from nowhere. It arises only on the basis of causes and conditions, because all phenomena arises, all functioning phenomena, all conditioned phenomena arises by means of their causes and conditions. And similarly, attainment of omniscient state is also a conditioned phenomena. Therefore, it arises only from causes and conditions.
Kamalashila, 말이다. kenjin shiwozu tsame te kona ni tuba. Di namshe luba Kamalashila zaisha. Pasna ngai jiwan jai. 차선을 잡다면도 럽스 자르니 디나들이 야오 실수샤 안에 상계에 다 땡땡지를 좀 세하게 다와 되기 가서 그 교든제 땡지 예벌 때네 먼저 주베 가서 먼저 주지 탑디 때. 아, 땡지들은 중에 가서 다 다들 윤제 된지사 윤제 된지를 때네 아니 먼저 주베 터주 뒤때 윤제 된지 루어메버 임부 니디 주더드르 뭐고남 라왕 주버메바 담버 주버메바 뒷단의 편이 달라되네 다 친절로 가서 우리 그게 다 따와 뒤다 세야지 디세어 거네 내릴 줄 손이 무슨 남중가 디셔지 거래 자 말하는 뭐 양 도서 뭐 소스 키고다 나는 미리 셔야 되게 왔다 게 남주 셔야 돼야지 어떤 거 까만실에 참여대 거는 유튜브에 만들어만 소인도 전에 다 뒤아우시 어디송샤
one of the very important texts of the Indian Nalanda tradition is the Tattva Samgraha, which was composed by Shantarakshita, and Kamalashila composed authoritative commentary on this text. Recently, I began reading this text. It's actually quite a difficult text to read, but there was one particular section which was most excellent and really appealed to my mind, because normally in my presentation of the Buddhist path, I always try to explain the core of the Buddhist understanding of nature of reality on the basis of the understanding of the principle of dependent origination, pratitya samuppada, and how the principle of dependent origination is first understood on the level of dependence in terms of causes and conditions, pratitya samuppada in terms of dependence of causes and conditions, and then how on that level and the Buddhist teachings on the ethical practices of avoidance from negative actions and engagement in the positive actions, and the whole ethical framework is presented on, on the basis of the pratitya samuppada teaching of causes and conditions, and how from the understanding of dependent origination in terms of causes and conditions, one can then move on to a deeper level of understanding of dependent origination, where one understands all independently originated phenomena as being devoid of any substantial independent existence of their own. And on that basis, on that level of understanding of dependent origination, then the Buddhist tradition presents the path to full awakening. So this is normally how I present it. But however, recently when reading Kamalashila's commentary on Tattva Samgraha, I found a section which presents this exactly in the way I normally present, but in a very eloquent and succinct way. So that was the most appealing.
다디 슈디디도와 아티 슈르르데 똑같은 담배 세아티기 태종 고요 시기요. 최럽도 남지 세아 최럽도 남지 싫어 세아디 럽도 남지 제바 세아디 짜라체 precise number 예 와 아니 간다 된 지심버 다 달라줘야지 된 지심버 시비 싫어지고 럽도 남지 제비 싫어지 소소떡배 싫어지 그도와 자자가 되게 소소떡배 싫어야지 용이야 냐라 태존 보고요래 근데 이나 산배 태존 매나 될 잡아주고 말해 잡아 먼주나 잡아 마슈나 아니 디턴 가도 쉽다고 봐 남이로 첸셔야 돼 용만 봐 사실 이 메뉴잖아요 가서 좀 똥바던 담배 쓰다 내가 좀 보시죠.
So Kamalashila begins with his statement saying that the intelligent who wishes to actualize the omniscient state. So the reference here of the term, the reference to the term intelligent is very important, because what Kamalashila is pointing out is that it is only those with the critical faculty, those with the faculty for inquiring mind will be able to probe into the deeper nature of reality. Because if you don't have that critical inquiry, and then there will be no opening into the understanding at all. However, in order to have that kind of critical inquiry, one must first begin with a sense of openness, an open skepticism, and a questioning mind. Because if you don't have a questioning mind, then you will not be able to engage in a much more precise manner. Therefore, it is with an open skeptical mind that you begin, and then you develop this critical inquiring mind, and this will then lead to the attainment of wisdom. And the wisdom is characterized in the Buddhist tradition as discriminative awareness. And discriminative awareness suggests an awareness that probes the aspects and the characteristics of nature of reality in a very precise manner, in a very detailed and precise manner. Therefore, the reference here to the term intelligent is important.
저는 참여 중나라. 저 띠 가르치고 있어봐이나. 내가도 털두기 그나 가서 우리 거기 민두버 용대버 디디 민두버 동에 용대버 디 나라도 동에 수시야 말봐. 동에 수시야 말에 야 말에 이네 동에기 가다 이네 동에 용대야지 동에 두지기 규지 소소 사체 달다는 저 동에 뭐야래 저 동에기 규지 동에 이버 미시버지 야 달라 치로 떠든지 근데 인도산에 가다 동에디 삼업면적으로도 와 다 대화성에디 디규 디셰베 거네 다 대화 누구 알아다 등에 mendition도 등에 유튜브 알아 대화디 대신도 다 디규디 좀 차이잖아요 디규디 시 규디 다 규디 셰베 거네 다대 라도라네 거다 저거 디기디 뭐야래 디디 메이주잖아요 내가도 더도 대베 디기디 참면적으로 해서 셔야 디기 세우시도 봐 간다 되기 쉬대하기 친절하게 남도기 동의게 거야래 친절 말로에 뭐유네서 지머지 셰베 다들 친절 말로서 내로 더도 셰고 말다 다 간다 진짜 인도산에 배는 머리벌레 니순대야 돼. 대코나니를 먹으면 머리고 랜저를 먹으면 머리고 사실 니실도가. 제가가 응원도 주베 사마디 랜저를 먹으면 머리고 동다. 수신도 셰베 참아 될 때는 용대야. 녜리디 대코나니를 먹으면 머리고 동다. 대코나니 치지 말라고 셰베 참아 될 때는 용대야. 저 세면적 셰고.
So with reference to this, if you look at the classical Indian text on Brahman, epistemology, there is a discussion of how all the attainments that we wish to achieve and that are positive are ultimately or directly or indirectly fruits of true knowledge or understanding. And implicitly, it also suggests that much of our suffering and pain and dissatisfactions and unsatisfactoriness and so on, these are fruits of lack of knowledge or lack of true understanding. So here, for example, none of us, there is not a single sentient being that deliberately wishes to suffer and deliberately aspires for suffering. However, the fact that we do continue to suffer means that we are in one way or another creating the conditions for that suffering that we undergo. So so this suggests that at some level there is a form of distortion going on, because although what we wish is to avoid suffering, but we create the conditions for the suffering. And similarly, what we wish is happiness. But however, in order to attain happiness, we need to cultivate the conditions that would give rise to happiness. And if you look at the conditions that give rise to happiness, in one way or another, they are all related to some way of understanding the nature of reality. So the closer we are to our understanding to reality, the greater the chance for us to have the ability to create the conditions for happiness. So in this way, we can see how in one way or another, directly or indirectly, our sufferings are a result of either a lack of understanding or knowledge, ignorance in the form of just not knowing, or a more active form of ignorance, which is a misknowing, knowing the reality in a distorted manner. So we can see that directly or indirectly, all our sufferings are fruits of these two forms of unknowing or ignorance, whereas all our happiness, whether it is an immediate, temporary happiness or whether it is a long-term happiness, they are directly or indirectly fruits of understanding, fruits of knowledge. So this fact that our happiness is a fruit of both long-term and short-term, are fruits of Brahman, true knowledge, seems to be quite clear. So in the Buddhist text, when we speak about a distortion of the nature of reality, we can talk at different levels. In the Buddhist text, the two main forms of ignorance that are identified are ignorance pertaining to the understanding of the law of causality, cause and effect, law of karma, and then there is also an ignorance pertaining to a distorted understanding of the nature of ultimate nature of reality. So these are the two primary forms of ignorance or avidya. So the expression which we read here, who wish to actualize omniscience extremely quickly, indicates the main subject matter of this particular text. What Kamalashila is stating is that although the methods for attaining fortunate rebirth and so on, and methods for attaining liberation from samsara, cyclic existence, may be presented, but these are not the primary subject matter of this text. The primary subject matter of the text that he is composing is all the methods for attaining the omniscient state of Buddhahood. That is the primary aim of this text.
That the and Shamdharma Durban Debu good day, many season the Dasha, which is Savaji, the good day, number of Savaji, Chasmati, or Mado, do never see the Chasmati is. The Tangu, the good, never the good Chasmati. 대비가 그 그래 딱 참아 많어 딱 많어 순간에 그러나 뭐만 참만 그 참고요 참만 되네 고름만 로 장이잖아요 그걸 돌아도 되지 그걸 가서 그게 정말 라바라바 그러면 불러주는 수시면은 정말 라바라바니아를 장 전에 차차와 디디 서와 칠다 님부 가사 님부 예 님부 묘치 칠그 때는 방적 정말 차차도 해야지 봐 방적 라바 전부디 님 중문세야 되네 방적 차도 디 님부 칠지는 것도 딱 받아들 그게 가서 그래 미주선 정연하는 누가 철철 치는데 누가를 그냥 공을 펴서 뭐 주면 정말 차와차와 있어야 된다. 어쩌다 표시가 되고 있어. 제가 뒤에 전에 그림만 다 뒤수. 다 뒤수인데 나와나 차와만을 남긴 거를 차와만을 가졌으나 네. 당시 그 보관사에 인지 따와야 주. 전주스 유래주 특히 핵심이 있어요. 이제 인지 따와체 대의 중에 일본인의 전주스 따와 대 통다 바수리에 별 오는 동안 저가 있는 통다 바수리에 별이가 좌시엔디 특 타시마사 급디 전주 생기 제가 바로 지금 부시에요. 대인은 또 돈도 실치예요. 돈도 실이 타치치네. 지금 타치치야. 아버지는 돈도 실이 인지의 전주 생기야. 통다 바수리에 좌시치. 아주 대수들이 남기 그또 대수들이 중시하고
So now to present the subject matter of the text in a very summary, kind of broad outline, the text begins with the emphasis on the point that attainment of omniscient state of Buddhahood is a result of causes and conditions, creating the causes and conditions. And then the second point Kamalashila makes is that it's not enough simply to cultivate a single cause. The cause must be complete. And if the result that one is aspiring for is a result that is very comprehensive and has many different aspects, such as the state of Buddhahood, the omniscient mind, then similarly the causes and conditions that one is cultivating to attain that resultant state must correspond to the richness and complexity of the state that one is aspiring for. So therefore, the cause, one must cultivate the cause, and the cause must be complete and also unmistaken cause. So then when he talks about what he means by cultivating a cause that is unmistaken, he talks about the nature of the cause itself should not be unmistaken, and then also one should not be mistaken with respect to the varieties, the elements of the conditions that are necessary in terms of number, and also more importantly in terms of the sequence of the cultivation of these various causes. And the sequence of the cultivation of the practices needs to correspond with the process in which our mind goes through a sequential transformation. So, for example, in order to counter the various negative aspects of our thoughts and emotions, we need to cultivate their corresponding antidotes, and these antidotes must be cultivated in a sequential manner. For example, if you're washing a cloth, the initial dirt, which is much more obvious, can be removed by the initial efforts and the using of the soap. But if you want to really get rid of even the trace of those dirts, then you have to put a lot more effort, and also you have to use much more powerful soap or whatever it is, detergents. Similarly, when it comes to the matter of countering various negative aspects, destructive aspects of our human mind, although the grosser levels can be countered and removed with the initial stage of efforts and application of their antidotes, but the subtler the negative aspects of the human mind are, the greater the power of that antidote needs to be, and also the greater the efforts needs to be applied. Therefore, when cultivating the conditions and the causes for attainment of omniscient state of Buddhahood, one needs to cultivate these in correspondence to the way in which our mind and thoughts and emotions go through a transformation. And then later, having made that point, then Kamalashila identifies what are the key conditions that must be cultivated to attain omniscient state of Buddhahood. Then he identifies what exactly is that omniscient state and how is it achieved. So he identifies the three main factors to be cultivated. One is compassion. Compassion as the root, as the foundation. And then second is the bodhichitta, awakening mind. Awakening mind which is rooted in compassion. So the awakening mind here is defined as an altruistic aspiration to attain Buddhahood, which is endowed with two aspirations: the aspiration to bring about others' welfare and aspiration to seek full enlightenment. And then he says that the third factor that he identifies is what he calls a perfection of the skillful means. But here he is really referring to the six perfections, the six paramitas, and particularly the last paramita, the perfection of wisdom in the form of the realization of emptiness. And these three are the key factors he identifies as the causes for attainment of omniscient state of Buddhahood. So these are compassion, bodhicitta, awakening mind, and wisdom of emptiness.
아니 인지 제한이 일단 장바도 인지 다음 장바도 인지 수단에 야와다 그냥 다른 장바 분명히 처음으로 이 인지 수단 다 그래 인지 지금 말도 인지是对孩子读不起啊，对不起啊，还是话，第一，读书是昂时的啊，这样子，因为呢，你写这个那个让出来听一点读不起，这个没有。概念这样的情况就不一样，因为恰当的这些，那恰当说的，那个读不起，但你是在呢，还是满足恰轨移动的恰轨，明年的落得了，气了那么多的这一年。这才是恰过来，并不是这点，并不是花钱，这个人间落地还是恰过来，但人间落那么多，假如有那样，现在落地炒了的了，并不花钱，就是那么些写了花钱。样的那是影响。但一年影响在里啊，别太那好，用这个影响去用，单单影响。这那个人走要白的这个，他说这个吃过拉过点，那你要弄起来是吧？前年。这个这样，大概呢，热下吃过两汤之后就这样，先读那的，先吃过，先读那的闹得了，读那的前两年的在，一那样，先得了，先进吃过的越的。那就是目前，不是目前，那个当初大家朝前引起的是，目前是目前引起的，还是有时，目前台湾有时，目前台湾有时，以那样后， 항상 그게 원래는 유주로 그게 실을 쳐서 또 자마서 또 많게는 지금 장바 자와 다가 실을 용어제 안 유유의 일단은 그 좋아지는 거죠. 예, 맞아. 쌀 인지의 장바다 가사도 그래 주시.
대박.
대박. 이 너무 좋아 제일 연구하시면 돼. 그래 저 남지 실을 좋아하시니 너무 인력을 주되 실을 좋아하시는 거 용어야 지금 나오는 거지. 그들이 인간에 나와서 인지 제일 센터가 리공사이언스. 맨은 일단 이 제일 그 싸움 많은 거야. 그 균기 의학이 그것이 용어들이 와요. 뭐 행위 용어들이 와요. 오히려 그럼 소야 오히려 딱 근데의 인지들이 싸움을 차지하기 위해서 근데의 인지들이 세전 랑 경제주체 랑다 랑을 녀 랑을 아니 체도 틀리게 되다 세레 로 능력 로직 그리고 대례나 쓰는 거 무시하는 거야. 대리로야 이 문제지. 야 문제는 지금 제주도에 세진이 또 랑주지. 채내가 나 이제 세진 내내지. 랑주지. 셴주지. 또 셴주지. 뭐 셴주는 나와도 무슨 재미. 대를 때문에 이게라고 인지디 찬지. 셴찬. 디고도 용감히 랑주지. 많이 이해해서 계시는데 대리 눈에는 대화도 랑 자원에서 이거를 들으면 되게 나 디고디 에 타이의 셴 인지산에 그것이 탐에 인지디 영어는 실을 좋아하잖아요. 알지? 나는 인지사 그리고 무시하지 않지. 배려가 잘 그런 우주도 거들이야. 세계적으로 인지, 시대적으로 인지, 민민적으로 인지세 정도가 셴 인지 삶에서 인지 친구사 되게 영어 우체국 배우들이 삶의 인지 청구체 인지 청구를 생산하는 거 생산하는 거 처음 민민적으로 배지겠어 인지 청구체.
So we begin with the first factor, which is compassion. So generally, when we speak of compassion, we are talking about a certain quality of our mind, and compassion and loving kindness, they are intimately connected with each other. And the way in which we understand the distinction between the two is that loving kindness is a mental state that focuses upon others' happiness, whereas compassion focuses upon others' suffering. So compassion is that wish, that mental state that wishes that other person or being to be free of suffering. So that's generally how compassion and loving kindness are defined. But however, if we look at the nature and characteristics of these mental qualities, such as compassion, they are quite complex. And also we can see different types and different degrees of intensity of these emotions like compassion. Generally, when I explained how we should understand these emotions, the occurrence of these emotions in us, one thing that I explain to people is that we, in some sense, at its fundamental level, these mental qualities are innate qualities and qualities that we possess naturally as human beings, as living beings. For example, one of the fundamental drives of a sentient being is a quest for survival, and we can see the presence of these emotions as contributing to that survival need. So if you look at the basic pattern of human emotions, we will see certain types of emotion that are more geared towards gathering the favorable conditions to our survival. Then there are certain types of emotions that really belong to our mechanism of trying to remove those factors and conditions that are obstructive, destructive to our survival. So in this, looking from this broad pattern, we can see that compassion belongs to that part of emotions which aims to gather together the conditions that are favorable to our survival. So compassion helps us, for example, connect with others. Compassion helps us bring others to us, whereas the contrary emotion of that is aversion or anger or hatred, which tends to have a tendency to push away the obstacles that are destructive to our survival. So in that sense, we can see how compassion, in a sense, belongs to that category of emotions within which the primary kind of modality of those emotions are attachment, because attachment brings the conditions that are helpful for our survival. However, if we look at the actual compassion itself, although in its natural state for many of us, compassion may arise in the context of attachment. For example, compassion to a loved one, someone that is close to us. In these instances, compassion arises mixed with attachment. However, this does not mean that compassion can arise only with attachment. There is a possibility of, because when compassion arises mixed with attachment, then the primary basis of the arising of the compassion is self-referential, because someone is my friend, someone is my family member, I love him or I like him. So there's, in these natural settings, when compassion arises in the context mixed with attachment, the basis of the compassion is really self-referential. However, it is possible to experience compassion where there is no self-reference. A mere sight of suffering in another can arouse compassion in us. And in that context, the basis of that compassion is not self-referential. It is not because this person is my friend or this person is my family member and so on. So, therefore, if you look at compassion, there are different levels and different types of compassion. Some mixed with attachment, some may not be mixed with attachment, but however, there may be some form of clinging. So from the Buddhist point of view, and even these compassions will be seen as somehow afflicted, because, so for example, when you, in response to the sight of a suffering of another person, if you generate compassion, but underlying that compassion there is a strong clinging to this, this person, then that is a form of affliction. However, that still doesn't undermine the fact that it is a natural compassion, it is a genuine compassion. So, however, what this suggests is that compassion and similarly loving kindness and also admiration and so on, although these may arise in the context of afflicted states of mind, but in themselves they have the potential to be freed from these afflictions and clinging. And in fact, they can be cultivated on the basis of wisdom, on the basis of understanding. So when a compassion arises purely on the basis of thinking about others, then there is a potential for that compassion to be infinite. Because when the compassion is directed only towards self-referential kind of considerations, whether it is to one's family member or friends and so on, then it is by its very nature, such compassions become limited, because the object of that compassion is limited. However, and also it's biased because it's self-referential. It is directed, it is extended only to those with whom you have a relationship. However, if the compassion arises only on the basis of the sight of others' suffering, that compassion has the potential to be cultivated to the infinite level, because then the compassion, and also unbiased, and that compassion is simply premised upon the fact that just like myself, the other too wishes to be happy and wishes to overcome suffering. And that simply becomes the rationale for the cultivation of compassion. So when you cultivate compassion in that way, then it can be infinite, because the others, when we speak of others, we are talking about infinite number of sentient beings. And similarly, because that compassion is unbiased, therefore it has the potential to be extended to all beings. So you can see, therefore, when we speak about compassion, we are talking of quite a complex emotion. And therefore, in the Buddhist text, there are mentions of different types of compassion. For example, a limitless compassion. There is a reference to what is called the great compassion. And even within the great compassion, for example, Chantakritis, entering the middle way, identifies three main types of great compassion. One, simply focused on others' suffering of sentient beings. Another one where the compassion is tempered with awareness of the transient nature of all beings. And the third level, called the non-referential or non-objectifying compassion, where the great compassion is tempered with the realization of emptiness of all beings. So there are mentions of these three types of great compassion. So one of the important points being raised by Chantakritis, talking about three different types of great compassion, is to underline the point how the wisdom can play a powerful role in complementing one's experience of compassion. For example, the first type of compassion was purely a compassion focused on others' sentient beings suffering, whereas the second level of compassion was a compassion that is tempered with the wisdom or realizing the impermanence of all beings, their transient nature. So here, although all three types of compassions are equal in being a state of mind where the focus is on others, and the character of the mental state themselves are a form of a wish that aspires to see all sentient beings free from suffering. The difference really lies in the complementary factor. In one case, the wisdom is the realization of impermanence and anitya, or transient nature. In the third level, on the third level, the wisdom is the wisdom realizing emptiness. So you can see, depending upon the quality and the subtlety of the wisdom, it has an impact upon the type of compassion that you have.
for some money, giving money, no, music, those. And music necessarily, conditions to mean music. Music is not all that you move to mean music. That thing that you move to one day, that you move to Xiao and Chen, and shit, music. The those color, and learning to come there, learning to tell the music. The dream is that other come the to name most of sooner, and the letter that is on the young and other subject, and now tell meaning that means tell to mean genuine is shape. You see, to mean genuine is shape. If you mean Tajin is shape. To mean Tajin is shape, to mean beauty Tajin is shape. To mean good Tajin is the care on Jesus is to my come, you care, you don't care, put on you don't care. Nhưng trong this my people and this is nhưng kia được rồi đó nào sao nhưng tôi nhưng kia được rồi nào đó thì cái gì share the name to the also we share we 그래서 cái điều trong đây thì nhưng một cái point như thế ya sao một sao nơi sinh gì mà sao bị phiền toái那是那些继续的，给你家庭成为，那这个才能无限的，家庭成为一点点，上当，继续那是那些因为，继续的家庭成为，继续的家庭成为气质到我的这个原因呢，那我们比较的善，然后第一套呢也苏格吉的，苏格吉，苏格吉。是不是就不要上第三班？是在办公室都上班，今年就上不出来，是吧？
So now, when we talk about cultivating compassion, particularly in the way in which the Buddhists understand great compassion, Mahakaruna, if you look at the actual quality of the mental state itself, there are two elements that are necessary. One element is what the Buddhist texts refer to as a sense of endearment towards other sentient beings, a kind of a sense of endearment which has a strong affectionate core, so that when you relate to others out of a sense of affection, with a strong sense of connectedness. And the reason for this is that in its natural state, the closer you feel towards someone, and the greater the affection that you have for that person, the greater your feeling of unbearableness of the sight of that person's suffering. Therefore, in order to cultivate a great compassion for all beings, you need to cultivate that sense of endearment and affectionate attitude towards other sentient beings. The second element is a deeper understanding of the nature of suffering. It's the suffering that we wish others to be free of. So the practitioner of compassion needs to have a deeper understanding of what is meant by suffering, that you wish all other sentient beings to be free of. And here, for example, in the first sermon of the Buddha, the sermon on the Four Noble Truths, he begins his teaching with a sermon on the nature of suffering. So when the Buddha talks about the nature of suffering, the truth of suffering, although the world of suffering includes physical sensations with the painful sensations and so on, which are the evident suffering, the sufferings that are most obvious and evident, that's not what the Buddha means. Nor does he means here what in the Buddhist text is referred to as changeable suffering. These are sensations and experiences which conventionally are identified as pleasurable, but they have a tendency to culminate in a form of dissatisfaction. And that too is not what Buddha means by suffering here. So the main suffering that Buddhist practitioners wish others to be free of is the third level of suffering, and this is referred to as suffering of conditioning. And here, what is being identified as suffering is a much more fundamental meaning of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, and here primarily referring to our own existence conditioned by karma and ignorance, karma and the afflictions. So our existence that are governed and conditioned by karma and afflictions is really seen as the pervasive suffering of conditioning. And this is what you wishes the practitioner is trying to cultivate, the wish for all beings to be free of that suffering. So therefore a deeper understanding of the nature of suffering needs to be cultivated. And again here, the question, one needs to have understanding at least that this is doable, that sentient beings, it is possible for sentient beings to gain freedom from that level of suffering. So the third element is required, which is a deeper understanding of the very possibility of such freedom from suffering. And here, when we speak about the possibility of freedom from suffering, in order for suffering to come to an end, the causes and conditions that give rise to suffering has to be brought to an end. So the question is, can the causes and conditions that give rise to suffering be brought to an end? So here one needs to reflect upon whether these causes are limitless, infinite, or whether there can be a limit, an end to this chain of causation. And so here, generally, of course, all conditioned phenomena, they arise, they come to cease, because they are all anitya, they are all transient. But this is not what we mean by an end. So the kind of end of suffering and its causes that we are seeking is an end that is deliberately brought about by application of their antidotes, their remedies to the suffering and their causes. And so here, the question is, are there powerful antidotes that can be cultivated that can bring about the end of suffering and its causes? So here we are again talking about, are they within the world of our mental experience or mental realm, are there forces that oppose to each other, so that by cultivating one camp, we can reduce and bring about the end of the other side. So here, this takes us back to the discussion we had earlier, how within our mental states there are some that are grounded in true knowledge and understanding, there are some that are distorted. So we can see that many of the antidotes for the causes of sufferings are really mental states that are grounded in some reason, understanding, and knowledge. Therefore, if that is true, then by applying these powerful antidotes, we can bring about the causes and conditions that give rise to suffering. And this indicates that the essential nature of mind itself is not polluted. Essential nature of mind itself is understood to be clear light. It's luminous. So these are the three main elements that needs to be understood. So you can see that the task is becoming more and more complex and complicated.
단지 지금은 계시 지금 남쟁이 누가 대통 중요한 좀 와요. 그래서 저는 산에 있어요. 유지수이 계시게 지금 들어가다. 와. 나 안들이 디시하고 나서 계시를 지금 남쟁이 생이데 소리하지. 계시를 지금 남쟁 인가 인류 유의상 완전 계시를 지야지 지금 친구 그 때는 가래 계시 그 니기 지금 이렇게 돼. 우리는 유의상 완전에 다 유의상 완전인가 인류 안 샤마타는 내용이 루체샤에 공부들이 내용이 샤워지는 거. 그래서 근데 인류 계시 지금 완전 인자 유의상 완전에 그것도 내용이 내용은 나는 싸운 너무 힘이 샤워지는 주잖아요. 차가워 너무 무슨 샤워지는 주잖아요. 그 중요한 장치인 거지. 또 세우고
then the text goes on from page 53 in kind of more deeper or more detailed explanation of the characteristics of the suffering and cultivating the understanding of the nature of suffering. The text in that section begins with talking about the specific sufferings of sentient beings in the unfortunate realm, and then it goes on to talk about, so this is the first level of suffering, suffering in the form of painful sensations, and then it goes on to speak about the second level of suffering, which is the suffering of change, with reference to the Deva realm. And then it goes on to talk about the third level of suffering. So this is on page 54, literally the first para, the second sentence. The first sentence. We read, pervasive suffering is what arises under the power of causes, characterized by actions and disturbing, characterized by karma and afflictions. It has the nature and characteristics of momentary disintegration and pervades all sentient beings. So the point being made here is not to state that the very fact of transient nature itself is suffering, because then even the Buddha's omniscient mind is transient, it's impermanent, it's anitya. But the point being made here is that all conditioned phenomena are by their very nature transient, and their transient nature is not dependent upon some other third factor coming into the equation. The very fact that they have come into being from a cause also brought about their nature of being transient. So they are, in that sense, susceptible to change on a moment-by-moment basis. That's their very nature. So having made that point, so in this case, the specific cause and conditions that are being referred to are karma and afflictions, because we are now talking about samsaric existence of sentient beings. And so the key causes which govern our existence are karma and afflictions. And among the afflictions, particularly the primary one is really ignorance that distorts our understanding of the ultimate nature of reality. So the form of existence where our existence is governed by our past karmic actions on the one hand, and our propensities towards afflictions such as attachment and aversion and ignorance. So that state of existence is referred to as the pervasive condition, suffering of conditioning.
지 얘네 다시는 될 거네 그렇죠 지 다 동네 안 된다래 동네리가 문제되고 수고하고 영양 어쩌야 되나 어마 현재 마성 공을 남대무사 남대는 루지 동네 있는 주산에 대래 잔주 것들을 이주세 자 리그에 인지 사업이 영어 이주 사업이 어떤 고용 만나서 이제 랑den도 동네 사업이 있다네 내가 루지 동네를 샤로고 예배가 유 동네를 샤로고 다 달라야 아니 동네를 샤로고라가 이해를 이네 지 루지 동네 말 동네 동네 제가 동네로 교수인데 제가 면도를 이룰 때 이내 꼴찌 가서래 윤제 띵좀 상고 아니 동네 어야지 두 싸워 많이 거잖아 능지지마도 동네 뭐야 탐수의 상관 메인은 되게 탐주고 지금 내는 거다 생각하는 동네를 그러다 동네 미술로도 줄을 해야 돼 얘네 또 동네는 것도 뭐 이거도 근데 진짜 대리 나도 나오고 리뷰 안에 그냥 나오는 상황 안에 나 리뷰 동네 그래서 주제서 이제 상황 안에 다 아주 대리 지지가 이다데 비슷와 아주 대리가 루시 중에 하나 장세 이 가운데 비슷와 강다 여자로서 용을 꾸는 제거 나서 쓸지가 다다 강다 다운 년과 나서 생생 유도다 감내장 용의 유인데 차나 정도 신을 주는 거 하나 있어야지 다다 동네 처음이고 다들 깨잖아요 동네 깨야지 둘은 두 마상으로 넘는 게 되듯이 차가는 누가 신도 맞아 그래 내야 돼 그래서 가야지 좀 제가 그래서 디상당이 우리 동네에 한국 그것들이야 또 주셔서 시험을 할 때는 우리 동네 상관없어
So now in terms of actual systematic approach in cultivating having explained the practices of cultivating compassion, then the text goes on to speak about the explanation of how to cultivate the bodhichitta, awakening mind. Now, with respect to cultivating compassion, traditionally, there were two principal approaches or methods that were presented, and both of these methods are really aimed at cultivating what is referred to as this loving kindness, a sense of endearment towards all other sentient beings, this affectionate attitude towards all beings. And traditionally, there were two main techniques or approaches for this. One is known as the one begins with the cultivation of the recognition of all beings as having been your mother, and then it proceeds from there. So that's one, and this is known as the 7-point cause and effect method or approach. And then the other approach, the second approach or method, involves equalizing self and others, recognizing the fundamental equality of self and others being wishing to overcome suffering and wishing to attain happiness, and then exchanging self and others on that basis. So these are the two main approaches, both of which are really aiming to cultivate this sense of endearment with the relation to other sentient beings. Now, of course, as we discussed earlier, one of the key elements is to have a deeper understanding of the nature of suffering, and based upon that, developing a genuine wish for others to be free from that kind of suffering. So in order to cultivate that kind of very deep aspiration for others to be free of suffering, one needs to have that level of wish to be free of suffering with respect to oneself. Therefore, one needs to do this practice first upon oneself. And here we are talking about 3 levels of suffering, the evident, obvious suffering, which are painful sensations, and then the suffering of change and suffering of pervasive conditioning. Now, in a naive sense, we can say that we don't need to cultivate the wish to avoid suffering at the first level. Even animals are capable of wanting to avoid the first level of suffering. However, if you think more deeply, it's not, it does require a certain degree of cultivation, because of course our tendency to be aversive to suffering is only in a sense reactive. So when you have actually encountered a suffering or painful experience, then we tend to kind of shrink back and react and be aversive. But however, we are not that cautious when it comes to the causal stage. So we will create the conditions, but once you have created the conditions which will then result in a painful experience, at that, when the experience actually occurs, although you may be aversive, you may wish to avoid it, but in fact you have yourself created the conditions. So what is required is a cultivation of a state of mind where even with respect to the first level of suffering, you deepen your understanding so that you prevent yourself from creating the conditions. And here, in fact, Kamalashila is making this point in page 53, the penultimate paragraph. We read, "And there are those whose minds are bound by various fetters of afflictions like craving. Others are in turmoil with different types of distorted views. These are all causes of suffering. Therefore, they are only in intense pain, like being on a precipice." So the point being made here is that so long as you indulge in these afflictive states of mind, in a sense you are like someone who is standing on the edge of a precipice, because you're going to be all the time anxious, because the suffering is going to arise any minute, because you have already gone through the chain of causation. So, and then once you have deepened your understanding of the causal mechanism of suffering, then you can cultivate a strong wish to be free from even the causes and conditions of the first level of suffering. This then deepens in the understanding of wishing to avoid the second level of suffering, suffering of change, and finally suffering of pervasive conditioning. And once you have developed that kind of disenchantment with suffering, or this form of disillusionment with suffering, particularly the third level of suffering, then you will be able to extend that, shift the focus, and extend it on other sentient beings. So that's the procedure. Therefore, in order to cultivate genuine compassion, great compassion, one needs to have what is called a genuine renunciation, a true aspiration to be free from suffering oneself.